Okay, we are live. Uh, we let's start with Anant today and then go down.
Thank you. Um, yeah. Let me know if I'm too loud. I'm at a coffee shop. Uh, yeah. So I just start with some like a couple of meta comments. Is just reading this made me realize that as somebody who's trained in sort of classical engineering principles, so to speak, in like mechanical engineering and adjacent fields, uh, kind of grew up using a lot of proprietary tools, and so the modern engineering vocabulary is dominated by that. So my appreciation for like open source sort of software ecosystems grows over time. Every time I read things like this, it's just the quality is it's just amazing. And also, I think Vitalik, for what it's worth, I think he writes really well, especially this sort of technical explainer that makes you feel like you understand it, but after a while, when I think about it, I don't understand it. So that was my initial impression of just reading through this, and it was a really good sort of roundup of key initiatives under surge. I believe I guess the main overarching goal is sort of increasing the TPS, sort of the bandwidth of the relay one, uh, and like so the different approaches, which I can't pretend like I can grow all the details, but I sort of made notes of things that were sort of keeping in my mind and maybe going a little deeper to understand it. Like one, of course, the sort of the 375 kilobytes per slot. I think that's the limit now. Sort of seems like there is a path to get that to the 16 MB that will put the transaction like L1 TPS at about like 60,000 TPS, which is very exciting for a number of reasons. But it seems like there's a nice part there. The other important part that I sort of made note to look into is sort of the signature aggregation schemes, and I think you made a point on the BLS signature taking a lot of effort and perhaps even reducing the compatibility with trusted hardware chips. And once that maybe there's a ZK snap wrapped around that could be used for that, but I'm kind of curious about that on how that might play out. The um, yeah, the sort of um, the data compression. Uh, so like, and that we had was really useful. I mean, related to the signature aggregation schemes, it's kind of you can see sort of benefits that you can get from these schemes. The plasma stuff, it's again, it seems like it's for like scaling beyond these initial improvements, and it's for more consumer uh, applications demand kind of demand that, but I don't think I understood that. The L2 proof systems and the cross chain L2 interoperability seems like that. It's really good to see like, like Vitalik for giving attention to the user experience of those L2s. I think it's come up in this call before on how like switching between tokens from one L2 to another L2 is kind of like rewiring uh, like different Ethernet cable to something for their transfer. So, and I think we also mentioned, I forget if it's a particular article, but Vitalik himself has been like fooled and lost money in like changing really tools. It seems like that is the costing LT interoperability is going to be sort of a major theme going forward, and I'm excited to see that play out. Um, the um, yeah, I mean, I found this link. I'll put it in the chat. I found this link to sort of I think there is a part where we linked to Lean as sort of some sort of like a formal verification tool that can help sort of do formal verification of the proof systems that's compatible with say VM specifications, kind of similar to how other formal verifications happen in hardware design. I found that interesting, and it's just a link thing. There's a game for natural numbers in that link that I found um, kind of interesting to play with. Now that's made as well. Yeah, the last point I would make is, I mean, all of this reading, all of this again, going through this lecture series with this group, and even my previous attempt made me think that realize that it's trying to spend too much time on the sort of internals of L1 and L2 architectures. It's useful to have really good orientation, but I'm going to assume that all of this is going to come through, and sort of it seems more interesting to think about what happens after and like what are the practical implications of that. And one place, obviously, I go is sort of the amount of, I think this also came up in the previous conversations when people talking about the roadmap, is sort of the financial security or the economic security that the L1 currently sort of underwrites. And I think that side like MakerDAO as sort of like an interesting example of like a serious DeFi application built on this L1 and sort of kind of lends more credibility to all the uh, security and the cryptographic properties of these systems. But I found out that they have Maker has since renamed to Sky, and there's like a whole governance thread on it, which I find it kind of interesting how sort of one of the brands that I thought was like a cool application of changed its name. So it seems like getting this um, infrastructural improvements and like enshrining some of the core stuff on L1 is useful. It seems like another example where you pawn off some of the um, logic to other layers on top, or like there's this notion of app chains and stuff like that, which uh, I don't know how that'll evolve, but and for what it's worth, I thought I'll bring that up. I'll also link this uh, sort of like a fun dashboard that one somebody built modeling the risk for. Uh, I think the Sky protocol now. The other place my mind went is obviously the risks, the economic risks, the financial risks that these uh, other applications can bring to L1 and how that might look like. But that's a whole separate topic. I would stop here for now. I rambled enough. I'll pass it to Anuraj.
Uh, yeah, so this was also a little a lot to digest. So every time I read this, I don't remember what I had read previously. So some of the things I've already read, but then I don't remember. But it seems that a lot of the parts of the surge are already implemented. I had seen this uh, blobs are coming stickers 2 years ago at Istanbul. So I think a lot of it is already done, and then the UX with L2s are going along fine. The ZK EVMs are coming along, so a lot of the parts for the surge are seems to have been implemented. So but I still don't understand like what's the difference between Solana, because Solana is all I think doing most of the stuff on L1, so they are making some trade-offs for the speed, which Ethereum is not willing to make. So like I've not understood that. And yeah, on the roadmap, I also see that the light client research always takes a backseat. So even in the current, I think there was some sort of shuffle in the R&D functions, and then I think I didn't see the light client parts in the current Ethereum Foundation organization. So there seems to be like not so much interest there. And yeah, so those were some initial thoughts. Passing on to Ben.
Yeah. So it's this is difficult to talk about, not because I don't understand it, because I understand it a bit too well. Um, so I don't want to go into everything in too much detail. But sort of the basic idea of this whole scaling thing is, think about it like, in the body. Um, DNA is replicated in every cell. And this sounds, when you first hear it, that's wasteful. Why do you have it that way? That's actually sort of like an equilibrium that's not that expensive for DNA. It's expensive, but it's not ultra expensive. And it solves the problem of, all right, where's the DNA? How do we get to it? Um, by in a sort of very trivial manner, but is very effective. Um, so, and it really is decentralized. You're not reliant on like an organ that has all your DNA or whatever. Um, and I see that as sort of like the base layer L1 model of, all right, data is maximally replicated. Any peer node that joins the network has the full set of the data. even if they only care about a minuscule percentage of that. And that feels, and the issue with that compared to like your body is that if you wanted to actually capture all the world's transactions, that would not be possible with that kind of full replication, because there's just too much data. And our computers are amazing; they can do billions of operations a second and move like trillions of bytes without too much work, but they can't handle 1,000 or 1,000,000 times that yet. Maybe I always wonder, like in a certain amount of time, like maybe like some like photonic computing or super powerful crystal storage or something, we could end up in a world where all this stuff is unnecessary and it just falls back down to, well, you just download the entire planet's transactions onto your hyper smartphone, and then that's that. And why there's no need to any additional complexity because you can just do everything. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. We do seem to, it's going to probably be a century or so before we are there. So the question it becomes, how do we actually, do the hard problem and split things up? And it's because that's where you hear the data availability problem. In sort of the naive case of your cells where everything is maximally replicated, there's no data availability problem. Everyone, if you're a member, you have the data, and can always sort of assume that, and it works. The problem is if you need to split things up. So the hard part that we're actually trying to solve is how do we have a transaction? How do you know that your transaction that you care about is covered by the economic finality of the system? So how can you be sure, without too much cost or too much trust really, that you have a transaction that sends you some coins, you see it, you'd be like, all right, I want to make sure this isn't double spent, or this is not, in Ethereum terms, an invalid state transition. And how do I know that? And if you've got your L1 node and it's an L1 transaction, it already does that automatically. The question is, how do you deal with that when you don't have, when you're off L1, when the data is somewhere else, when the state is somewhere else? How do you make sure you're being captured by the economic finality? Because if you're not, it just falls back to some other trust model. You're basically interacting with the bank there, which I mean everyone does, or at least everyone who can does nowadays. But the whole point of crypto is try to move away from that. And then all these trade-offs just come down to what I call the variable I call it doesn't call is coupling, which is how if you have a group of chains, you can call them various L1 and it's all its L2s or whatever, and you want to have them economically finalized together, sharing the economic finality set, in this case would be the validator set. How do you sort of handle that and get people to how do you make that easy, and how do you and there's lots of different ways. Ethereum has tried to find ways to capture certain parts, and to explain this in a way that won't take an hour. All right, I do have a critique on sort of how Ethereum has done this though, and I understand why they've done, but basically, especially in the L2 space and the roll-up space, they have refused to lead. They didn't. The Ethereum Foundation and Vitalik did not create their prototypical. This will be our roll-up. We're releasing code for our roll-up. This is how the roll-up works, and so this is our security things. And obviously, it would be open source. It'd be publicly available, so anyone could have copied that and said, "Oh yeah, we got a roll-up just like Vitalik's or whatever, or the EF Foundation, or the enshrined roll-up, or the leader roll-up." They refused to do that. And they said, all right, we're going to try to fund various, growths like, Arbitrum and Optimism, and, Base came along and did its own thing. And I understand why they did that. They were trying to be, quote, decentralized in terms of, we're going to let a million flowers bloom on our garden and not try to favor one child or the other. But I think that was a mistake, given that the goal of this is to make all this stuff invisible. If the goal of it is to make the whole thing invisible, so the user never has to think about what kind of like side chain they're on, then yeah. So yeah, so you end up with effective standards and a lot of confusion. See, I didn't even know that optimism is now the effective standard. I don't spend too much time actually deeply in the L2 space, but I feel like that they're developers. They want to think of themselves as like, what's the best way for a developer? The best thing for a developer is not have to learn any standards and just make your own, because then you don't have to think, or you don't have to talk to other people, or try to coordinate. And they didn't want to be seen as the leader. So they said, all right, well, let some other people do it. And I think it just made a mess. And the problem with this is that the mess becomes exceedingly complicated to deal with, because there isn't necessarily a single great thing that works. It's I mean, maybe there's Optimism Superchain, but I know there's Arbitrum, and they've tried to do other things as well. And there's various ZK things floating around, and then there's Base, which is basically their own thing with various trade-offs, like Central being basically just a Swing Coinbase chain. So I feel like they made a mistake by not taking leadership and making it clear, not just like this is the direction we want to go, which they have done, but this is the thing, this is the standard we're pushing. And maybe there would be political fights over exact details of the standard. There always is, always going to be. And maybe some other people would have split off and been like, this is bad, and we're going to try to do things differently with our competing. But I feel like by refusing to take leadership, they made the situation considerably worse. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why the L2 space in Ethereum is so confusing, and pretty difficult to follow. And they're finally getting to the point like MetaMask does handle various L2s, but it's, if the goal is and I know that the Ethereum people wanted the goal to be, all right, you'll all be using this thing called Ethereum. You'll click on the thing, you'll send coins, you'll do your a DeFi or your prediction market or whatever, and all this, like kind of like, you don't care where Google's data centers actually are. You don't care where which Amazon, like, unless you're a developer, you don't care which Amazon instance or Amazon location you're actually at. All that's stuffed into the back end. That's for the devs to worry about and set up, and the user should just see this smooth, beautiful surface. And they sort of set the system up in a way that makes that maximally impossible, instead of a way that's obviously going to be impossible for a while, even if they acted perfectly. But I feel like they strongly went against that vision with what they actually did, and it's made a mess. But reality is a mess, and I suspect there'll be eventually a way through this. Anyway, I think I've babbled enough. I'll move down to Jenna.
Thanks, Ben. My audio, yeah, hard act to follow, but I'll be quick to, only because I've got two main things that have been on my mind with this, which is here, I'll drop this into the Noise and Tippin have become pretty popular on Farcaster, and I've been watching it with some amusement. And when Noise first dropped, that red on-off button, I have full credit for that, because I pinged the guy and I said, how do I turn the whole thing off once you've got it set up? And he said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And so what you've got, though, in case you're not following it, is people are getting a gabillion penny transactions. So if somebody likes your cast, you get a penny or whatever they've set it at. And in addition, you can now assign any token. So I looked at mine recently, and I don't get that many, but I've got all kind of weird tokens coming inbound at little penny ante shit. So it's creating this wave of transaction data that clearly makes me understand what needs to get solved. So I appreciate this, if that's what we mean by surge, I like that a lot. And then, Venkat, I liked your toy suggestion. I haven't read through them yet, but I dropped in my Claude version of it. So maybe we can build some games that help us play that. These are all going to be mini apps next, right? The other thing I wanted to mention for this group, I think everybody knows we're running this granola to Substack pipeline. And on Friday, it came up that it's not obviously capturing everybody's ideas necessarily very well. And so if we want to layer on a level of, you could drop some bullets into the chat and I would put them into Granola before I hit the enhance button. And that would be fun. Anuraj, I just saw your point. I think that these things don't count. I saw somebody say that it's not part of tax reporting, but I wanna go find the what is that true? Just to mention it. But back to if anybody wants to drop in a bulleted list, kind of if you're taking your own notes, I'd be happy to throw them into Granola before I hit the enhance button. So with that, on to you, Nathan.
I don't think I have like anything super insightful to say. This time around, I think Ben's take I thought was very, very interesting. So I just want to compliment. I think it's really helpful. I really enjoy having Ben's point of view on these calls. I think it's really helpful. I mean, some of my takeaways, the data compression kind of about with transactions is interesting, but some of the more like aggressive forms do seem a little at odds of moving Ethereum towards more stateless nodes. And it did something like, and that actually didn't dawn on me until I kind of was scanning through this the second time before this call. And so I kind of almost want to go back and look at the rest of the roadmap because I feel like there may actually be other things where, because this roadmap is, it's almost less, it feels like less of a roadmap and more of a wish list as we've dug into it. It does feel like there are there's probably other items on the list that are like, yeah, like, but how far do you want to take this? And this actually doesn't, and starts to conflict with other goals, which I think Vitalik probably understands because there's a lot of talk about like, well, this is sort of a sliding scale and where do you want to be on that? But I think that's would be an interesting lens to go back and look at this through. When I was re-looking at the section of like L2, how to sort of trust L2's verification, it actually put me in mind of some of the stuff that Venkat's been working on with protocols recently, which I will admit I have not followed nearly as much as I probably should, so I might be like misunderstanding some of it. But the 2 out of 3 with this, like a human security council, so almost felt interesting. Like it almost felt like if you generalize that into beyond the blockchain, like there's almost this sort of like primitive 3-branch government, but make 2 of the branches protocols idea, right? About how you can kind of have human arbiters, which is important for things like law, but still kind of pipeline and regularize a lot of other systems. I know that's not really Ethereum related, but that was something that kind of jumped out on me. I had a point I wrote down about that wallet UX, but I think Ben actually said it better than I did. So I think the last thing I will say is I think some of the work in around verifying the EVM that Hal was talking about that needs to be done, and that it was interesting that sort of Risk-5 raised its head again, and it did make me think back to the presentation I saw, the little talk I saw about the work that's happening at Risk0 around making sort of a full ZK Risk VM with a Risk-5 CPU. I also feel like, I'm not kind of remembering it, but I feel like there was one of these that talked about, there was a very speculative idea about like, oh, well, maybe we should just like swap the EVM out with something like Risk-5. And it just was sort of an interesting data point of how much Risk-5 seems to be beginning very subtly dominate, I think, a lot of discussion space. And I think a big point to the power of open design. So yeah, not I had a lot of thoughts that were really directly Ethereum related, but just some things that were rattling in my head as I was reading this. So I'm going to pass down to Venkat.
Okay, so yeah, I don't understand a whole lot about any of this. So I asked ChatGPT for toy examples, and they kind of basically confirmed my shallow pop science understanding of what's going on technically. And I guess if I ever need to, I'll need to dig in more technically deep. So my standard for comprehension right now is just, do I recognize the terms and roughly have an idea of what idea they're gesturing at? So I guess, yeah, this is all super interesting and there's some risks involved and so forth. I think the one point I formed an opinion on is actually what Ben was talking about. What he's calling a mess, I think of that as actually a wise governance decision. So the decision not to lead is a little bit like, democracy is the worst system except for all the others. There's a trade-off here between not very deliberately not offering an opinion or leadership on certain technical fronts in order to let certain kind of pluralism and diversity flourish. And that's, I think, a kind of like democratic architectural decision in Ethereum. It's a little bit like in regular cloud computing, what they used to call polyglot persistence. So this was back when they were doing service-oriented architecture about 10, 15 years ago. And it's basically stuff like letting every small team pick their own internal architecture, so that so long as they publish the same interfaces, same standard interfaces to the rest of the company, which meant including things like deciding what languages to use internally in the team. So this was the polyglot aspect. So I think that's some version of that is what Ethereum has kind of like consciously decided to do. And yes, on the one hand, you do have this messy chaos. Bridging is a mess. The different chains have like different standards of actual security. Bridging across L2s is a mess and so forth. But the upside of this is you get basically the kind of diversity you get in a democracy. And one of the sort of data points in favor of that is, yes, if you want just a standard L2 that does L2-ish things, what you would do is clone the open source optimism stack and then call it something else. Like, Base is an example of that, though I believe they've customized a little, but they're basically playing nice within the optimism stack ecosystem. So that's why they're part of the superchain, I guess. So superchain will be kind of like a large sub-ecosystem within which I'm guessing certain things will be easier, especially maintenance and security levels and how much you can expect guarantees. But things like bridging may be equally hard. So think of it as like Optimism Superchain is like the EU, and if you're like on Arbitrum, that's outside the EU because it has certain advantages in certain sectors. So Arbitrum is optimized for finance, so it's very reliable for DeFi, but it's not as flexible for other purposes. And then you have things like DAI, which is Gnosis chain, which is struggling these days. But that's kind of like diversity within the standard L2 paradigm, but there's also more. Like if you look at Xerox Spark's Lattice, which is kind of a not really an L2, it works at L2 type abstraction layers, but it's fundamentally an on-chain gaming engine, gaming and worlding engine. So this is what I mean by interesting diversity. If there had been a quote-unquote official solution pointing the way to this is the way L2 shall go and this is the way you'll scale, you would get what's called scale up, right? Scale out. This would be the equivalent of scale out in like traditional cloud computing terms, which is like go horizontally to increase capacity, but fundamentally you're creating a homogeneous kind of scaling. Whereas what this agnosticism does is allow kind of an economies of variety to happen where you can have different kinds of properties in different scaling vectors. So it's not super opinionated at this point. So you get a lot of different opinions coexisting. So lattice is one. I would also point out eigenlayer. I don't quite have a clear idea of how eigenlayer is doing what it does. But one way to think of it is it takes something standard like the optimism stack, chops off the um, much of it, and instead builds an alternate architecture on that that simply takes L1 trust guarantees and packages them for applications that need trust as a service. So that's what eigenlayer does. And this is like again living at the L2 level of abstraction, but it's not standard L2 in the sense that this article is talking about. So all this I think is only possible because Ethereum governance is choosing not to have an opinion here. But yes, no question about it, you're creating a certain amount of like muddiness and messiness, just like with democracy, especially multi-level federal structure democracy. You do create a mess of 50 different regulatory regimes in the case of the US state biased system and so forth. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting choice, and I posted in the comments I think Solana gets its advantages at the expense of certain kinds of centralization, which means its decentralization is really a pseudo decentralization. But yeah, it's a credible alternative. The trade-offs are legitimate. It's not a scam. So Solana, I think at one point people were thinking of it as kind of scammy, but I think consensus now is it is a legitimate alternate solution that's making certain trade-offs differently. And yes, you'll get something that probably enterprises that want to do enterprise stuff might prefer. But just as Ethereum has its sort of like idealized promises it makes about like censorship resistance and stuff that are not realized in practice. So L2 sequences, for example, are centralized, right? So that's a way the narrative of censorship resistant decentralization breaks down. Similarly, Solana, it makes certain promises in its idealized sense of extreme speed and number of transactions and stuff, but it keeps breaking down under stress, which Ethereum L2s don't seem to do. So there's there's differences at the level of what are you promising to do, and that's basically technological opinionated politics. And then there's the question of how much are you actually delivering on what you're even promising, assuming somebody agrees that what you're promising is the right thing to promise. So I think both Ethereum and Solana are struggling to fulfill the promises they've made, and they've made different promises. And I think Bitcoin is worth putting in this picture. It's basically made almost no promises. It promises very little and delivers very little beyond, the quote unquote L1 of Bitcoin. So things like Lightning are kind of like somewhat half-assed things that get somewhere. But anytime it tries to do anything of the sort Ethereum or uh, Solana do, it gets caught up in like the community rebellion, and Bitcoin people simply don't want to do all these things. They don't want to go anywhere near a world computer type idea. But okay, yeah. So that's basically my few remarks. Back to Anuraj.
2 minutes left. Any more comments?
Just so I know, is anybody going to drop some notes in, or is nobody interested in that? Which is fine either way.
Notes meaning granola notes.
Yeah, your own high-level bullets that I can drop into Granola before I run the summary function for the Yak Talk newsletter. I'm happy to wait a little bit if people are interested. That's all I really mean. Oh, yep, Nathan's got one. Anybody else? Just so I know to wait or not. No pressure.
We can drop Venkat's chat GPT notes maybe.
That's a good point. I see that, Venkat. That's fine. Okay. I think it actually grabs you speak in such complete paragraphs. It does a good job with your note with your verbal contributions.
If there are no more comments, then we meet in 2 weeks.